Ik heb u gezien. Stop sharing.
So I'm not watching the video. I won't be monitoring the video. Maybe it's not. Yeah, it's already there. Yeah, so I won't be in the
Hi, Stefano. How are you? Ja, maar kijk.
set gevraagd, want dan kun je die microfoon doorgeven.
Ja, maar dat is dan voor de discussie.
Ja, of ja, jij mag het zelf kiezen. Wat zie je het liefste? Ah. Ja? Can you hear that? Ja. Oei. Die werkt, hè?
Wil je het anders zo laten?
Ja, nee, deze gebruik ik sowieso. Maar nu... Nee, je mag nu ook niet gebruiken.
Gaan we dan niet doen?
Maar dan denk ik
Ik denk dat we wel... Zeker? Ik denk dat we snel moeten. Kijk, ik zal even naar buiten gaan.
ja, is goed. Onder controle, hè?
Pardon?
Het is onder controle, toch? Hè?
Meer licht in de zaal?
Ja, we hebben met opzet het licht hier gezet, omdat je anders is het op die camera heel
Ja.
Ja, als je meer van het licht wil, dat gaat.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. For many years, it has been an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure for me to work together very closely with today's speaker. And today, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, even if that means that I have to do something that is completely redundant, because we all know Dirk. We all know who he is. We all know a lot about his work. We all know that he is a prominent figure in cognitive linguistics and in linguistics in general. So I'll be very brief. After all, you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to Dirk's valedictory lecture. But even so, let me say just a few things, even that we know that he's a prominent figure. Let me just add a few numbers. So we know that Dirk has been very productive, still is very productive as a scholar, but how productive exactly? Well, let me tell you, Dirk has written 11 monographs, and then on top of that, 12 edited volumes, among which the Oxford Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics. He has written over 300 research papers, and next to that, he did a lot of lexicographic work for the Dutch Woordenboek der Nederlandse Taal, but also for Van Dalen. So that's really an insanely lot of work. But all that work was also very good work, high quality work that is very much well received and appreciated in the field. For instance, he was invited to give 50 plus plenary talks at international conferences and symposia. And on top of that, another 60 plus invited talks and courses at summer schools, so on other occasions. So that's all very impressive. He was also very generous in sharing his knowledge and his ideas and advice. For instance, he also supervised over 30 PhD students. So that's all very impressive if we think about these numbers. Coming back to his position in linguistics and in cognitive linguistics, of course, we know, I will only say a few things. We know that he can be counted among one of the founding fathers of cognitive linguistics, not only because he founded that flagship journal, Cognitive Linguistics, but also for his seminal work on semantics and on prototypicality in semantics. And now I would like to continue and talk about further and further achievements, but there's many. Dirk has told me that he will say a few things himself about what he did. And later on today, we will have a few other people. So I'll be very brief and stop here. And maybe one more word. I said a few things about the person. Let me say a few words about this room. Why this room? Well, there is a reason. This place is the aula, the classroom, where Dirk has been teaching generative linguistics to generations and generations of students. And therefore, we thought that it would be a good idea to ask him to give another talk here. And I see that many of those generations are represented today. So this is yet another opportunity for Dirk to teach to generations and generations of students. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, dear friends, I think I could stop here, and ultimately that's what it's about. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being so friendly to be here in what is for me quite a transitional moment. Now, I thought that since you are here anyway, let me try to entertain you, and entertain you with a funny question. The funny question being, could I explain the research lines that I've developed with the QLVL team in a way that is more or less understandable for a lay audience? Most of you do not belong to a lay audience, but some of you do. And I specifically care about them, so let me also talk to them. Specifically, perhaps, what would follow from the way we have been looking at meaning for the way we talk about language and meaning in a broader societal context? Now, what's funny about the question is that this is not a question that you normally ask when you stay in your academic bubble. But my academic bubble is bursting. And so I thought maybe it's time to confront reality, so to speak. So there we go, meaning and method, and why it matters beyond linguistics. Notice, this is vintage Geeraerts. An alliteration in the title. If you look at the titles of those works, there's a silly amount of alliterations in there. For some reason, I can't resist. So to continue that venerable tradition, here are the steps that I want to take. The productivity of prototypicality, modeling meticulously, significant semantics, a future for philology. So the questions I want to address under these headings are the following. How did the research program of the QLVL team and what I did before the emergence of the team, how did it develop descriptively? Then the second question, and that's going to be a very important one, how did it develop methodologically? What would that mean in a larger context? And what would it mean for the structure and nature of academic language studies at large? Okay, I'm getting instructions, so I'm following. So for starters, I have been, as Dirk has already indicated, I've been maddeningly productive. So the question I initially want to address is whether there's any structure in that madness. So I'm going to have a look at some key areas and key publications. However, before doing that, I very explicitly and very humbly want to emphasize that a lot, well, most of what I'm showing is the result of teamwork. Dirk Speelman has been my partner in crime for over 20 years. And I have further been blessed by a number of PhD students, ranging from bright to brilliant. And they have been crazy and courageous enough to help me develop my ideas. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, the core of what I've been doing, at least the conceptual core of what I've been doing, is situated in lexical semantics and lexicology. And that area is best represented by a trilogy of books that appeared in the 1990s. Okay, a trilogy. I mean, once you start with alliterations, it's only a small step to write a trilogy, right? The first part of the trilogy is the diachronic prototype semantics book of 1997, which basically draws on the work that I did on the Dutch historical dictionary in the first part of my career. Then there's the structure of lexical variation in 1994, and then a book on the evolution of the vocabularies of Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch in 1999. And later in the talk, I'll say something about the plot lines that connect the parts of the trilogy. But at this moment, let me first indicate how this area relates to other areas of research that I've been involved with. So on the one hand, I've added what you might call a meta perspective to the field of lexical semantics by looking at the methodology and the history of the discipline. This applies to my PhD thesis, which was very methodologically oriented, but then specifically also to the Theories of Lexical Semantics book, which gives a historical overview of the field. Then on the other hand, in the other direction, if you wish, so this is the direction making it more abstract, away from the pure descriptive work. Then on the other hand, there's a direction towards more applied work, and that's obviously where the lexicographical work comes in. In terms of practical lexicography, let me just mention the electronic version of the 13th edition of the Van Dalen Dictionary, and then the 14th edition. Okay. Then there's another extension that I added, if you wish, or that is related to that conceptual core. And that's a broadening of the empirical scope towards cognitive linguistics in general, and then specifically towards what we refer to as cognitive sociolinguistics, which is basically a way of combining the interest in meaning of cognitive linguistics with the interest in language variation of sociolinguistics. And I could mention lots of work done within QLVL. I need to see that screen. Yeah, thank you. Lots of work done within QLVL in that area, but let me just restrict it to this one monograph. And then, of course, once you reach cognitive linguistics, I can jump back to the meta perspective, if you wish, and then point to a number of things that I've done to introduce cognitive linguistics, position it, frame it in a certain context. And there, of course, the first step, or the first contribution, was launching the journal Cognitive Linguistics. Then there's been a volume of basic readings, and of course the Oxford Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics, which I had the pleasure to edit together with my colleague Hubert Kuikens. Okay, so that gives you an overview of the, let's say, the various fields that I've been involved with. And incidentally, this is, of course, also vintage Geeraerts, this kind of graphical representation, clarifying things. That's so well. Okay. Now I want to zoom in on the core area. The lexical semantic thing, or the conceptual part. And what is important there, and most of you will know this, but I'm going through this because it's important for the methodological step that I want to take further on. The important things here are that three ideas shape the exploration of that core area. First, pay attention to the members of a category. Second, don't just look from forms to meanings, but also look in the other direction. And third, recognize the importance of language variation. And to explain that a little bit further, we can start from what is a traditional view of lexicology, a structuralist view of lexicology, where you would just look at the relationship between words and meanings, and do that from two perspectives. If you look from the word to the meanings, then you're looking for different meanings in one word. That's polysemy. And if you look in the other direction, different expressions for one meaning, then you're looking at synonymy. Now, in the 1970s and the 1980s, a crucial step was taken by what we refer to as prototype theory, which originated in anthropology and psychology, and which adds the idea that there is relevant structure within a sense. So within one meaning, you have all the members, all the members of the category indicated by that meaning, and there's structure in that category. There are specific relations among the members in the sense that you have more central ones, for instance, and peripheral ones. All fruits are fruits, but the apple is more fruity than the avocado. Okay? All professors are professors, but the emeritus professors are very peripheral in the category of professors. Okay? So that's adding what we call prototypicality, and it involves looking at the relationship between senses and reference. Once you reach that point, okay, and so that's what I applied in the 1997 book, specifically from a historical perspective. Then, once you reach this point, you can go further and notice that this gap needs to be filled up. There's a gap in the picture. And there you can add the notion of construal, which is precisely looking for different categories represented by word senses, for instance, for talking about certain things. So that's adding construal, categorization, if you wish, as, again, an important and at that point relatively new way of looking at lexical and more general linguistic phenomena. But then you have to add still another thing, which is the third point that I mentioned, namely the importance of variation. And variation, linguistic variation, let's say the variation between dialects, between national varieties of a language like Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch, which we've studied a lot, styles, registers, whatever. And that obviously adds a further dimension, a third dimension if you wish. So we can represent that in this way. And this model, this overall model where you would have two directions of looking at the relationship between form and meaning, two levels, two layers of looking at it, and then adding the variational dimension. That's what's explained in the 1994 book. But then a further idea was added, and that's where the third book in the trilogy comes in. And that's the idea that once you have this relationship or this third dimension, you can also go through that dimension in two directions. In the sense that traditionally you would ask the question, how does a language variety influence the variability? What are the specific words that occur in this language variety or that language variety? But then you can turn the perspective around and you can say, okay, if I have a large number of variables, how do they together define language varieties? That's the line that we developed under the heading of lectometry, measuring the relationship and the distance between lects, where lect is a general term for dialects and national varieties and so on. Okay, now this overall structure of variation that we've been looking at has been, so this is just to indicate the two directions. So this overall program defined by that idea of variation was developed in various PhDs, which branchings beyond the lexicon. So questions would be, how does the interplay between meaning, social variation, and competing forms of expression operate in the grammar, not just in the lexicon? If you look at phenomena outside of the lexicon, morphology, perception, attitudes, how do they determine the relationship between language varieties and so on? A lot of work was done exploring these directions. And is still being done. Some of these lines have more or less become independent research programs. which of course I'm very happy for. So that is, first of all, oh yes, one final thing. So altogether, all these lines belong to what I would refer to as cognitive sociolinguistics, simplistically, studying variation of meaning and the meaning of variation. Right. But then what kind of methodology do you need for this? And here things start getting a bit more tricky. The methodological lines behind the research program are double. On the one hand, there has been an overriding trend towards using quantitative forms of analysis. And that's also reflected in the name of the team, in the name of the group, quantitative lexicology and variational linguistics. But then, and that's perhaps less visible, and that's why I want to talk a bit about that today, there's been a specific concern with indeterminacy in semantic description. And to talk about the quantification first, that primarily takes the form of corpus linguistics research in the QLVL team. Historically speaking, it started off in a statistically unsophisticated way in the 1994 book, then gained traction around the year 2000 in the Convergentie-Divergentie book and in the introduction of logistic regression techniques in grammatical studies. And then currently, and I'll say a bit more about that later, it takes a further step by the use of distributional semantic analysis. Now, where does that come from? Where does that turn towards that kind of more objectivizing, quantifying methodologies come from? Well, note first that with my background in diachronic lexicology is already intrinsically a corpus linguistic enterprise. Only it's purely manual, or it used to be purely manual. Historical semantics without textual data is just etymological speculation, which is fine, but it has its limits. And further, given that quantitative analysis is a staple of sociolinguistic research in the way it developed since the 1960s, you can't be serious about cognitive sociolinguistics, or you can't be doing cognitive sociolinguistics in a legitimate way unless you adopt the same standards of empirical evidence that are usual in sociolinguistics. So you have a number of reasons for going that way, but most importantly, there's a reason that has to do with the difficulties in describing meaning as such. And that's where the notion of semantic determinacy comes in. Semantic determinacy actually, or indeterminacy, appears in three forms and at three stages, so to speak, in what I've been doing. The first stage, but I'm not going to go into that, is what I discussed in my PhD, which is the potentially problematic relationship between theory and meta-theory. Then a second way in which indeterminacy plays a role is something that I've more or less stumbled upon more recently, which is the fundamental open-endedness of intersubjectivity. And then, and that's crucial, the issue of polysemy versus vagueness in lexical semantics. Now, I'm not sure if I will have the time, probably not, but they're not going to stop me. So you can always walk out, that's for sure. Let me say something about intersubjectivity. I actually was thinking, this is a real talk, so in a real talk, you always skip a part. Right? But I'm not going to skip the part. What I mean with the intersubjectivity thing is that, well, the starting point is the notion of cognitive empathy. Empathy is, this is not emotional empathy, but cognitive empathy, and that's defined as the ability to take into account another person's point of view. But then, of course, you have a problem, because if you're taking into account another person's point of view, then the question is whether that other person has an empathic point of view of your point of view. Right? And that reflective form of basically theory of mind in psychological terms, leads to a fundamental interpretative uncertainty. Should you assume, when you're interpreting what other people say, should you assume a non-empathic or an empathic point of view in your interlocutor? So for instance, a very simple example, and these are examples that are well known. If you take so-called deictic categories, referential categories like here and I and so on, you can have an Asian interlocutor or perhaps an American interlocutor saying to you when you're in Europe, I will call you tomorrow morning. And then from your European point of view, you can say, okay, is that my morning or is that your morning? Okay. In the your morning point of view, you're assuming that the other person is basically taking only his own point of view. If you say, you meant my morning, then you're assuming that the other person has an empathic point of view with regards to you. Okay. So that's an ambiguity, and then of course it's an ambiguity that can be monitored. People can send out signs to make clear what they are meaning, but still it's a very persistent thing, and it's a phenomenon that can be shown to produce ambiguities in basically all sectors of language use. In particular, for instance, it implies that all utterance can be interpreted ironically, which of course is a source of ambiguity, of uncertainty. So I would say that there is something intrinsically open-ended, shaky, if you wish, to what linguists often refer to as common ground, the convergence of opinions, of views in dialogue. Okay, so that's intersubjectivity, the open-endedness of intersubjectivity. And then there's the issue of polysemy versus vagueness. Let me just continue. Just briefly, terminologically, polysemy is just the idea that you have different meanings in a word, but then within the meaning, there are differences among the things that you refer to. So if you have sentences like, I have several trees in my garden, linguists draw trees to represent structure. That's this thing. Could also think of genealogical trees and so on. Then most people will agree that these are different meanings of tree. On the other hand, so that's polysemy. On the other hand, if you have this situation, we do not recognize that as different meanings. Those are just differences within one meaning. So the question is, what measures, what tests do linguists have to make the distinction between those two? Well, traditionally, you have a number of tests that are based on intuition. There's a definitional test, where you start from what the word refers to and try to find a definition that should conform to certain criteria. It should be maximally general, should specifically list common characteristics of the thing in question, and then it should also minimally specific. So you look for all the things that trees have in common, and that list should be sufficient to distinguish trees from shrubs and so on. Another test is conceptual, given a context in which a word is both affirmed and negated. Is that usage spontaneously acceptable? So if I say a formal representation of syntactic constituent structure is a tree, but of course it's not a tree. Strictly speaking, you can't say that. You're saying it's A and it's not A. But you can say it precisely because there are different senses of tree involved. And then a third test is syntactic. There are a number of syntactic constructions that require identity of sense. And so you can use those constructions to see whether you're dealing with polysemy or not. So for instance, a fir is a tree and so is an oak. That works well. But an oak is a tree and so is a formal representation of constituent structure. That's borderline punning. Okay? So there you can see that you're moving into the area of polysemy rather than vagueness. Now, the crucial point is that we can establish that these traditional polysemy tests are inconsistent in the sense that they do not, when you compare the three types, They do not yield the same results. And they're also each one separately inconstant, in the sense that applying a single one of them does not necessarily yield the same results across all contexts. And that's something that, that I explored in quite some detail in what I think is one of my most influential papers, and which, by the way, obviously has a double alliteration. So, but and a chiastic structure, and that apart. So there is a problem, right? And let me just give you one simple example to illustrate the problem. Take gloves and hats. I think we all agree that gloves and hats are items of clothing. But still, we can say things like, bring your finest clothes to the wedding and a hat. In that case, you're, in a sense, creating an ad hoc polysemy in which you restrict the notion of clothing to the central area. Because hats and gloves and so on are peripheral types of clothing. And if you were to apply the polysemy tests, the traditional intuition-based polysemy tests, that distinction would not come up. But apparently you can use it, you can activate it in a specific context. So there is a problem with the polysemy tests. And more systematically, I would say that it follows, first, that meaning has to be studied at the level of specific usage events, not on the level of the word as a whole. And that sort of follows from a prototype theoretical definition. And second, it also follows that intuitions need to be complemented with less subjective approaches, because the intuitions we have turn out to be fairly rough. And in case you have doubts about that, in case you're saying, yeah, but I know very well what I mean when I use a word, then just think about what you thought when I said that I would be doing something funny in the beginning of the talk. Funny is usually described in terms of a polysemy where you have funny, what makes you laugh, and funny, remarkable, what hasn't been done before, what asks for some attention. Are you entirely certain which reading of funny, which connotation of funny was actually activated in your mind when I said that I would be doing something funny? If you, in general, if you ask people to exactly define how they interpreted something in normal running conversation, people usually have difficulties to be precise about what's going on. So I would claim that the intuitions, even the intuitions about specific usage events, which in a usage-based approach would have to be the ultimate ground, the ultimate evidence on which you base your analysis, that those intuitions are not exactly as precise as you would want them to be. So the question then is, okay, but is it any better when we go towards another type of approach, the more quantitative, more objectifying approach, which is less intuition-based? Okay, so that's what we tried to do. And we then went through a number of revised polysemy tests, which actually take up the three forms of polysemy tests that you have in the intuition-based approach, but revise them or give them a new form. So there is a way of doing this in the form of referential description. Just take down, describe what kind of reference, what kind of things talked about you find in the use of words, and then do a bottom-up of analysis of the features of those reference and see what kind of structure you find. An example will follow in a moment. Then you have, and so that corresponds basically to what was originally a definitional approach. Then corresponding to the conceptual approach, which basically relied on spontaneous recognition of polysemy, I would argue that the whole toolkit of psychological meaning research is to be situated there, because that predominantly also tries to capture spontaneous cognitive processing. So there you would have reaction time experiments, eye tracking, also neuroimaging, whatever. And the third approach, corresponding to the syntactic polysemy test, is using distributional corpus analysis. That is to say, basing your semantic analysis on the way words appear in textual contexts. Now, in the QLVL tradition, we've worked intensively with the first and the third of these approaches, less so with, let's say, the psycho-experimental ones. And specifically in the 1994 book, that studied Dutch clothing terms on the basis of images and pictures found in magazines, and then translated that into a database of features, and that way defined the prototypicality of certain usages and so on. And another example I'm taking from the PhD thesis of Alena Nishanka, where we looked at color terms in visual web, or color terms that can be represented by visual web information, like a site selling clothes, for instance, where you would see and where you would have information about the hue of the clothing item that you might buy or not. And so one of the things that comes out of it is are results like this. These are the ranges of the words blue and navy plotted in a red, green, blue space, dimensional space. So the underlying colors in the way color is usually represented in digitally represented. And the interesting thing that you find is, I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but from an intuitive point of view, you would say navy is just a kind of blue. And you would then expect that the range of navy would be a proper subset of the range of blue. But that does not really turn out to be the case, in the sense that there is a certain portion of the range of blue, of navy rather, that does not fully overlap or is not fully incorporated in the range of blue. There are different ways of interpreting that. That's another issue. But what I want to emphasize here is that precisely by doing this kind of more objectified research, where you look at what's actually going on, just don't rely on intuitions, you get more information than what you can get from an intuitive point of view. And then, of course, for the distributional approach, we are currently taking that as far as possible with our nephological semantics project. And that's a project that uses a distributional vector approach, and that a distribution vector approach coupled, if you wish, with a visualization, with an effort at visualization. It's called nephological, because nephology is the study of clouds, right? It's a meteorological study of clouds. And so we represent meanings as meanings of words in context, rather, as points in a semantic vector space. Such a distributional approach consists roughly of two steps. First, you have to identify the relevant context features. That's to say, the words that occur in the context of your target. And then you have to detect patterns in those co-occurring features. And for each of these steps, you can perform them manually or statistically. And so you get 4 major distributional approaches: identifying co-occurrences, detecting patterns manually or statistically. And, oh yes, of course, this is also vintage Geeraerts. A 2 by 2 table, just 2 dimensions. sometimes 3, right? But if you can reduce it to 2 to get a clear insight, okay. So if you fill out the boxes, then the vector space approach is the one that is maximizing the, let's say, the statistical part, or that is trying to be as independent as possible from intuitive intervention, so to speak. And that is the direct opposite of actually where I started from 45 years ago, the traditional lexicographical work, where you would have your slips of paper representing dictionary or data that would go into the dictionary, and you would manually process them on both dimensions. But now, when you do that, when you take this step from the older intuition-based approaches to the newer ones, what do you see? Well, first, or importantly rather, the older problems actually persist. It's not the case. You're doing this because you want to go beyond intuition, and you can go beyond intuition, but you still have to see that, or you still notice that different approaches yield different type of information. For instance, a textual corpus analysis would not easily give you the same information on blue and navy and their relation than the type of data that I mentioned a moment ago, where you use the visual information in the data. And with regard to the problem of internal consistency of the tests, what we see now is that within a single approach, results are not necessarily constant, just like they weren't initially in the older tests. So distributional settings, so the parameters that you indicate to build up the clouds, let's say, to do the analysis and build up the clouds, the settings that work well for one item need not do so for another. Just a simple example from work that was done by Mariana Montes. We have data for herhalen, the Dutch verb herhalen, which has 4 different senses that we looked at. And then we also have data for heffen, which has 2 senses, to lift and to raise. And the point is that the model settings, so the parameter settings that work best for herhalen, are not the same as those for heffen. So for herhalen, you could get something like this. By the way, this can get even much more intricate than it is now. I'm staying at an initial level, so to speak, but let's not go into that. So you have the different senses. They're represented by colors. They were annotated, and you can see that this type of modeling gives you a relatively neat grouping of different senses. It's not totally perfect, but it's fine. In the case of heffen, it's even better because you can relatively clearly see one sense and then the other. But the point is that the parameters you use here to get this result, among many other models, are not the same as the ones you would want to use here. So if, I'm not going to go through that, but if you were to propagate these settings to the analysis of herhalen, you would get something very muddled. So all in all, we're still left with problems, right? So I would say, as an intermediate conclusion, yeah, I haven't finished yet. We're faced with a methodological tension. Neither mere intuition, let's say your inner experience of meaning, nor objectifying approaches offer a fully firm basis. So the question is, can we resolve the question? And the point I'd like to make today, and it's a relatively philosophical point, if you wish, is that the empirical approach, so the empirical approach I'm now referring to this more quantitative objectifying approach, the empirical approach broadens the basis for semantic interpretation with maximally objectifiable data, and it supports the interpretative efforts with quantitative techniques. That is to say, rather, as you might think superficially, rather than being the opposite of a more traditional, intuitive, interpretative approach, an empirical approach to semantics is the completion of it. And that also means that such a complementary view of the two approaches embodies a hermeneutic model, where hermeneutics is the traditional term for the theory and methodology of interpretation. That is to say, it embodies a model of how to establish meaning and how to interpret language. I've written a bit more about that in this article, The Doctor and the Semantician. Okay, so now let's take it one step further. Saying that you need to collect all the evidence and have a good look at it, well, that sounds commonplace. Isn't that what you would normally do? Okay. So why emphasize it? Well, let me have a look at some hermeneutic alternatives. And this is where the talk gets possibly contentious. Yeah? We'll see. So I'd like to compare the position that I'd like to advocate, which is, let's say, hermeneutic modesty. I'd like to compare it to hermeneutic agnosticism and hermeneutic individualism. Hermeneutic agnosticism is don't bother about the inner experience of meaning. Do semantics without meaning. Meaning is simply what meaning does. And methodologically, that would mean investigating the relationship between, for instance, the experimental, the referential, the distributional approaches, but do so without invoking the inner experience of meaning. And theoretically, that would allow for the possibility that the phenomenon formerly known as meaning is not unitary. If you have a closer look at it in this way and don't bother about what you feel with regard to language, what your inner experience is, then it breaks down into a cluster of separate social cognitive phenomena. It would be more or less similar to what happened to certain concepts in science before. And in the 18th century, for instance, there was this notion of life force, vis essentialis, which was supposed to be the basis of organic life. But then, of course, with the evolution of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and so on, that notion was broken down into a bundle of different physiological, anatomical, etc. systems. Hormonal regulation, respiratory system, etc., etc., etc. So there's no single thing that is the life force. It's just a number of things that work together. In principle, that could be the same for meaning. We don't know yet. You have to analyze it. And so this kind of studies, this kind of agnostic study, is definitely something that needs to be conducted. And those kind of studies would be an obvious follow-up to the work that I've described a few moments ago. And I hope that my successors will have the opportunity to continue along these lines. Aha, vintage Geeraerts. A conversation is not a good conversation unless you come up with a research idea. Okay? That's what's indicated here. And incidentally, now that we're talking about this, incidentally, this very incidentally pattern, this habit of making side remarks, and particular self-referential side remarks, that's also an irritatingly vintage Geeraerts. Closing the footnote. So, a radically reductionist, and some will recognize, some of you will recognize this as a kind of neo-behaviorist approach, is definitely something that can be envisaged. It might be interesting, it's part of the debate, but at the same time, I wonder whether it's not unnecessarily limiting. The inner experience of meaning does exist. In the same way in which, for instance, to come back to the physiological thing, pain exists. You have to take it into account. So even if it is a side effect, even if meaning is epiphenomenal and not ultimately decisive, it should be included in the scope of the investigation. And then there's another perspective, which is perhaps even more debatable, but still, think about the societal effects of saying just scientists, scholars, don't bother too much about meaning. We now have computational algorithms that perform amazingly well at simulating human linguistic behavior. But if our inner experience of meaning no longer distinguishes between us humans and those algorithms, if we say even in humans it's just a side effect, it doesn't matter really very much, then doesn't that lead us to a blind trust in machines and big data? And I'm not sure whether we want that. I mean, the more you're saying that humans are like machines, the more the machines become like humans. And that's at least something you want to keep in mind, or you want to keep an eye on. So I'm trying to say something about the broader societal effects of following a certain conception of meaning. And if your conception of meaning is that meaning is a side effect, that it doesn't really matter all that much, then that would have important or potentially important effects on how you think about, for instance, the relationship between man and machine. But then there's another form of hermeneutical alternative at the other end, going all the way for intuition, so to speak. And that's the approach where you would privilege your private experience, where you would basically assume that your way of interpreting things is the ultimate truth. And that I would claim, or suggest at least, is the underlying linguistic stance behind the actual polarization of social debate that we are seeing at the moment, which of course in its most extreme form happens in linguistic social activism of the type that you find in political correctness, wokeness, cancel culture, and so on. So what it implies from an interpretative point of view is, among other things, an absoluteness of individual perception. When I experience something as offensive, threatening, whatever, then that is objectively so, regardless of any intention on the part of the interlocutor. You also get decontextualized approaches to meaning, whereas we've seen precisely that meaning is highly contextualized. Decontextualized, for instance, even that if, suppose I would at this point want to explain why the use of neger or negro or a similar word is offensive. Some people would even object to that, to my using that word in a meta-linguistic way. And if you do that, well, then basically linguistics stops. Third example, or third aspect perhaps, this leads to, or that approach would lead to a non-accountability of statements made about meaning. If you say, okay, this is how I feel it, and my feeling, my experience is privileged, then that opens the door to making sweeping statements about linguistic meanings that can be passed without evidence. So overall, this is, I think, the other extreme where the tendencies combine into a polarizing non-negotiability of meaning and a moralistic hermeneutics of suspicion and accusation, where people are relentlessly blamed for their language. That is an attitude that is at odds with the contextual flexibility, the intersubjective open-endedness, and ultimately the methodological indeterminacy that I think falls out of our descriptive work. So against these extreme tendencies, forget about meaning, or my meaning is the best meaning, so to speak. Against these two, I'd like to argue for hermeneutic modesty as a basic way of dealing with language in a social context, meaning maximize your observational basis, make sure you have evidence, derive an interpretation that is as close as possible to that basis. That is to say, an interpretation that is, okay, alliteration, this must be serious. Okay. That is careful, circumstantial, and conjectural. Careful because it takes into account a maximum of available evidence and looks for the closest fit with regard to that evidence. Circumstantial, because it tries to capture how conventional meanings are modulated in specific circumstances, in particularly also an interlocutor whose mind is not an open book. Remember the intersubjectivity thing. And conjectural, because it is ready to acknowledge its own probabilistic approximative nature. Meaning is always an invitation for conversation and dialogue. That's a basic thing I would like to emphasize. So, as a final step, what would this mean for language studies? Well, in its focus on critical evidence and interpretative integrity, this view of our dealing with linguistic meanings is ultimately philological in the sense in which philology is the older term for language studies and seen as the scholarly study of, well, traditionally older text, but maybe broader than that, the scholarly study of text and languages. And it's also philology in the sense in which this room is a philological location par excellence. Dirk already referred to the fact that this room was special for me because I've been teaching in this room for many years. It's also special because, for instance, when we had I think that was a breakthrough conference in 1993, the International Cognitive Linguistics Conference in 1993, the plenary sessions were held in this room. It's also special to me because ultimately when I was studying Germanic philology so long ago, many of the courses took place in this room. And this room, this entire building has been, let's say, the sacred hall of philological studies, Germanic philology and Romance philology, as it was then still called, basically after the Second World War. I think the building was built in 1950, roughly. So in referring to philology, I'm also paying a tribute to the room, so to speak. Now, why do I mention philology? Well, philological studies, as they emerged in the 19th century, combined diachronic linguistics, describing older languages and tracing the relations between those languages, with a scrupulous reading of historical texts, and a philosophical self-conception of language studies as a Geisteswissenschaft, a human science rather than a natural science. If you see what's happened in the 20th century, and specifically the second half, then you've seen a parting of ways between linguistics, which became increasingly system-oriented and naturalized, moved in the direction of natural sciences, both in the definition of its object and in its method, culminating in late 20th century formal linguistics, whereas literary studies have often been influenced very much by postmodern and critical trends, which take a quite different approach to language. So there's been a parting of ways, and I think that's a pity. And I actually think that what's happening these days in linguistics could be the basis for a new, or if you wish, a revival to some extent of a philological approach to language studies. Because what we're seeing now is that linguistics is moving towards a view of language that is contextualized and usage-based, as I've indicated, that is aware of the historicity and social nature of language, something that obviously in an approach like cognitive sociolinguistics is quite outspoken, and that is enriched by the wealth of data, enriched but not totally determined by the wealth of data provided by empirical approaches of the type that I discussed earlier. Again, I've talked about this recontextualizing trend elsewhere, but let me now just come to conclusions. So, in short, I'd like to argue for a new philology that rests on 3 pillars: recontextualized linguistics, that's the theoretical part; digital humanities as a methodological toolkit for gathering and analyzing data that maximize the empirical basis of language studies; and an interpretive approach as described, one that, between the extremes of blind trust in data and rampant suspicion, embraces a conception of meaning that is critical, but in a careful, circumstantial, conjectural way. And to end on a personal note, I would hope that that attitude of a critical but circumstantial, conjectural, careful interpretation might perhaps be recognized by you, perhaps even remembered, as, well, vintage Geeraerts.
Thank you very much, Dirk. That was very inspiring and well presented as ever. Also, perhaps especially the implications outside of linguistics. I would say crystal clear, brilliantly brought, fantastically formulated. Now, I'm sure that all of you have lots of questions, things that you would like to say, but I'm going to do something funny. I'm not going to give you the opportunity to ask questions and give remarks, at least not yet. What I propose, you've had a lot of information to digest. I propose you take your time and we take a 10 minutes break and we continue at 3:15.
Ja, ik dacht even precies dat wat op deze persoon. Ik dacht even dat er iemand Ja, oké, dat is duidelijk.
It's post. Wait, because. Ah ja, wacht. Dat is omdat dat ding van.
Weet je? Zeg maar, hoor je geluid van de zaal?
Want hier moesten we. Het is nu. We moesten die camera daar.
Ja, maar wacht, je moet, nee. Je moet eerst Teams op dat scherm zetten als je dat scherm delen.
Ah ja, oké.
Ah,
Oké, we
Is
zien.
het? Hij hoort ons. Oké, we horen jou nog niet, maar we moeten het nog even regelen. Oké. Share screen. En dan gaan we verder. Kunnen jullie iets zeggen?
Maar wacht, want we hebben hier de camera.
Ja, maar dat maakt niet uit, hè.
Maar weet je nog dat we dat moesten.
Ah ja, dat was bij audio. Bij instellingen. En dan audio. En dan even iets anders kiezen. En dan terug hetzelfde kiezen. En hetzelfde voor die andere. Kunnen jullie nog eens iets zeggen?
Dus.
Oh. Nee, echt niet. Oké.
Testing your speakers on StreamYard. Sounds like they're working.
Wat was dit? Sorry. Maar horen wij nog altijd niet. Zij horen ons, maar wij horen hen niet. Wacht.
Wacht, maar mijn data. Staat dat hier dan? Ja.
Ja, maar dat...
Horen jullie ons nu?
Dan...
Ja, jullie
Jullie
horen.
horen ons. En wij horen jullie niet. Wacht, zeg nog eens iets. Ah ja, heel stil. Heel stil. Maar ja, die boxen staan gewoon niet luid genoeg. Dat dan goed. Kun je nog eens iets zeggen?
Wacht, maar zij zien nu niet.
Kan je nog eens iets zeggen?
Hallo?
Ja,
Ja.
perfect.
Oké.
Oh, wacht, dit is nu niet.
Oké, perfect.
Yeah, but they don't see it here.
Ja, maar die
Nee,
mensen...
ik zie niks van de zaal.
Oké.
Als je laptop kan omdraaien, of ja,
Ja, maar het is.
is een desktop.
Wat is het?
Is een desktop, of kan je de camera naar dit draaien? Of naar...
Nu
maar
zien jullie.
nee, dat is,
Wacht.
dat is omdat ze op Teams niks zien, hè? Wacht, op Teams, hè? Want zij zit in Teams.
Ah ja.
Maar ik weet niet dat Teams is. Ah ja, dat is hier. Dus als we... Wat is het? De camera van jou? En die zit ons. En doen jullie nog eens terug naar mijn zien? Zet nog eens terug op mijn zien.
Ik heb nu de sessie open gedaan en ik zie mezelf.
Nee, anders moeten we maar op integrated
Maar ja, kunnen jullie. Of ze kunnen ook via de.
Ja, dat is een minuut vertraging.
Ah ja, dat is waar. Oké, dan gaan we het via de integrated webcam doen. Oké.
Ja, sorry. We hadden die tafel nodig, sorry. Oké. Hoe gaan we dat dan doen? Dan moet je eigenlijk net zo op tafel zetten. Ja. Dus het gaat niet zo lang zijn. Ja, dat is wel niet ideaal, hoor.
Ik weet het, maar ja, het is niet.
Ja, sorry, jullie gaan een zijbeeld van de zaal hebben, want we krijgen de camera niet ingesteld dat die de camera van de aula overneemt.
durf het niet aan te zetten.
Ik zou het ook niet, maar ik vind het ook één keer proberen.
Ik heb het.
Ah, ja. Die zal ik...
Daar gaan zitten dan?
Ja.
Oké.
Waar is het?
Anders moet ik ook een Teams delen en ik ga daar echt iets
Zijn niet?
Ja, laat maar. Goed als die daar
Ik zie het dan niet meer. Deze?
Dan bovenste boek. Ja, ik vind dit. Ja.
Moet ik notities nemen? Dat is natuurlijk het punt.
Dat kan.
Ik weet ook wel wel.
Ik denk misschien ook maar wapenen.
Ik denk niet dat we en kunnen delen en
Oké.
Dus
Oké, maar eigenlijk begint, hè?
ja.
Dirk, misschien als het helemaal afgelopen is,
Wacht, dat ik niet aan het
dan
zien
zul
ga.
je misschien iets moeten zeggen over hoe de coronamaatregelen in bij de receptie verlopen.
Ja,
Want ik ga geen handen geven aan het lied.
ja, nee. Het laatste woord is aan Carlien, dus misschien is het goed om wat zeggen.
Dus dat je op het einde nog iets zegt van, ik weet het niet, misschien willen de mensen nog wel eens persoonlijk langskomen of zo bij mij, maar we gaan geen handen geven.
Ah ja, dat is goed. Dat is leuk. Ja, oké.
Is het stop?
Wacht, er is heel even een probleem. Namelijk dat zou zichtbaar moeten zijn daar. Maar het is... Maar,
Zeg, op YouTube is hij weer gestopt. Hè.
ja,
It was a difficult talk to write.
I don't think anybody.
Jawel, ja, it took me.
Ja, goed.
No, it's. I mean, there was so much to say.
ah, maar wacht. Sorry. Ja, nu wel. Oké, nu is het wel in orde.
Laat maar zo staan. Ik wou er nog wat bij tikken, maar dat mag ik gewoon.
Ja,
Nee, dat risico wil ik niet.
Oké,
People are seeing the... Alright. Oké, goed. Ja, je zit wel op een afstand, Adi. Dus als
Nou
je,
ja,
ik denk dat je best
als ik het maar
gewoon...
ongeveer
Ja.
kan. En een beetje water is.
Niks, maar ik had dat we daar gezellig samen zitten met.
Ja.
maar dus er is maar professional en de rest is... Dus je mag daar gaan zitten.
Ik ga gewoon aan die kant zitten.
Zijn we klaar met de... Houden we dit zo of wordt Lisbeth
Ja, we hoopten dat ze dus ook zichtbaar zouden zijn. Die gaan zichtbaar zijn.
ja,
Vanaf
na
dat we ze
AI.
opzetten.
En als je de micro wilt doorgeven en
Ja, je
begint te weten.
Ah ja,
kan dat
oké.
ook wel doen.
Ja. Ça va. En is daar, heeft Dirk ook een micro om
Nee,
te
dus we hebben
antwoorden?
geen aparte. Dus, ja, we hebben...
Ja, en dit
Er zijn-
werkt niet. Of?
Dat werkt wel.
Zou dit ook...
Ja, dat werkt ook. Dat gaat zo.
Voorstel is dat
Misschien dat je dat even zo stellen en dan...
Zit op deze micro ook thuis?
Oké, laat.
Okay, we're about to start. Okay, I hope you're all rested and you've given a lot of thought to what you want to ask. However, remember that question or that comment because it's not your turn yet. We've asked 4 discussants for people to ask Dirk questions first and to say a bit more about his career each time from different perspectives. And first, let me introduce the discussants. The first discussant is Arie Verhagen, Professor Emeritus from the University of Leiden. Also a prominent figure in cognitive linguistics, also very much into topics such as semantics, intersubjectivity. So that will be a first interesting perspective. Then the second discussant was supposed to be Geert Storms, professor at the Department of Psychology. He's into categorization research from a psychological, psycholinguistic point of view. However, for medical reasons, which are not COVID related, he had to cancel. He announced that two days ago, so unfortunately he cannot be there, which of course is very unfortunate because interdisciplinary work also is a very important aspect of Dirk's research, reaching out to other types of research and collaboration. Okay, the third discussant, and here, unfortunately, due to reasons of COVID, but not illness, but, well, problems with traveling. So the third speaker, discussant, will speak from up there, and that is Dagmar Teviak from the University of Birmingham, but who started her career here at KU Leuven. And I guess she will be talking a lot about more recent developments in cognitive linguistics, the quantitative turn, things like that, where once again, Dirk played a very important role. And then lastly, again from that screen, we have Lisbeth Hevaert, professor in linguistics here, and since recently our dean, and she will talk about yet another aspect of Dirk's career because he's not only a very insightful scholar, but he also has done a lot of work at the university in all sorts of roles that have to do with making the university run. So that will be yet another perspective. So let's start with the first discussant, Professor Verhagen. Arie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I have the mic?
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you. It's great. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation to. I can speak from here. It may be useful to be standing, but we can do the discussing sitting with it. I have you have heard and received a number of examples of vintage Geeraerts, and there's going to be more. Okay, if this clicker is too distant, then maybe the Okay, another graphic, three-dimensional picture to illustrate a particular, and I see nodding in the audience. It may be for some of you on the top of his head, so if turned around, but it is the prismatic model of semantic analysis, conceptual analysis, that first came to my attention in 1993. Through a reference by my morphological colleague, Ariane van Santen in Leiden, when I wasn't in Leiden yet myself. as something that was useful and might also interest me, and she was absolutely right, because this was in a study on semantic structure in idioms and compounds, and Ariana was interested in the as a morphologist in the compounds, but I was starting to look into construction grammar, and I was interested in the idioms, and there was something that we could share, and an idea that applied to both. And I'm still very grateful to Dirk and Peter Bakema, because that was the co-author in this paper in which I first encountered this. And I used it in my own first attempts to do construction grammar in the Dutch version of the way construction, and it works really well to a certain extent. The prototype of the way construction is a combination, an idiomatic combination in modern Dutch of the verb banen and the noun weg as an object. And originally, banen means to level something, to flatten out something, and combined with weg, it means facilitate the traveling, a leveling of a road. And it quickly acquired metaphorical senses in the second, in the domain, in the second plane, of a more abstract kind. The details don't really matter much, namely of removing obstacles and creating possibilities, with the verb being linked to the creating meaning and the weg word being related to the possibility meaning. So that works really well, and moreover, it also works well to describe different stages of the development of this construction, because this is how it got started. So people making an inference from a literal meaning to a metaphorical meaning, had the inference going from the first plane to the second plane. But nowadays, the banen only occurs in this combination and doesn't have an independent meaning. People don't associate it. It doesn't have this literal meaning of leveling off, flattening out anymore. So historically, it's changed from this picture, so to speak, to this one. This is what banen in this construction now does, indicating the creation of a way. And so this is all wonderful, and it demonstrates the power of the model. But I was not asked to only sing Dirk's praise, but also to ask a critical question, and this is where I want to raise a critical question. And I'm actually quite happy to have the opportunity to discuss this with Dirk and make a suggestion as well, and invite him to comment on it. I'm really curious to hear what he will say. So this is a really very different kind of process, because the inference takes place in a single individual's mind who infers initially. But the historical process of creating now being the literal meaning of banen is a process of conventionalization. And that doesn't take place in a single individual's minds. Nobody shifted the creating meaning from the second plane to the first plane, so to speak. We can describe the change here, but we miss out something of the difference between individual level and community level, social level phenomena within that model. So that is also something that I didn't hear, at least in Dirk's lecture just now. The conventions, the community level phenomena, what Rudi Keller, historical linguist, and Eva Dabrowska more recently have labeled phenomena of the third kind. They are approaches to community level conventional phenomena as results of human actions, but not intended ones. So they're neither natural nor individual, in the sense of designed by some individual human being, but they are community level created results of processes at a community level. Since they are not individual, they are subject to discussion. So this the idea of conventionality, in my mind, I would like to suggest, provides a basis for the desire for accountability for meaning at that level, conventional meaning. That Dirk also, like myself, actually would like to see and would advocate. And moreover, it allows us to sharply distinguish between individual level meaning versus community level meaning, communicative. So maybe here I'm doing something of the breaking down kind in the agnostic sense that Dirk has just been saying, but I'll let him comment on that. But in any case, I owe this observation to Herbert Clark, actually, but in a recent paper referred to it, namely that it may be a kind of unhappy coincidence of the English language being the language of our science, that the English term meaning has a certain kind of polysemy, namely using the same label for individual level meaning that we might want to call interpretation and conventional meaning which exists only at the community level, which are tools for communicating speaker meanings. So this is another thing that I would like to hear Dirk's comments on. To conclude, vintage Geeraerts. What I would like to suggest is that more C's need to be added to the kind of philology that Dirk is advocating, not just critical, careful, circumstantial, and conjectural, but separately, in addition to those communal, conventional, or cultural, which is not on the slide, but that's definitely has also subsumed under this. Dirk, I'm really looking forward to what you think about these notions.
Okay, thank you. First of all, something about things. I assume that I may be getting other questions about things that I did not discuss. What were the numbers again, Dirk? So, okay. In this case, I totally agree, Ari, that we need this level of conventional communal meaning. But one of the things that I think I would emphasize is that language is a flock. Language is a flock of birds. And that's, of course, the idea of complex dynamic language as a complex dynamic system. So if you are trying to model the communal meaning, we should be careful with the traditional way in which linguists in the 20th century have thought about the communal, the conventional level, namely in the Saussurean sense of a system that is more or less self-contained. It's not a system that is self-contained. It's a system that is continuously being changed through the interaction between individual and contextualized meaning and the communal level. And then once you reach that point, I think there's also a direct link to a cognitive sociolinguistic approach, because there precisely you have intermediate levels between what is common to all the speakers of the language and the individual. Because it's not just that all the speakers of the language share one system that is entirely the same. No, you get an overlapping set of a cluster, if you wish, of different systems where different people with different backgrounds, different socioeconomic status, etc., have different views of the language. And to link that to the prismatic model and usage in idioms, I think one interesting example of how there is a level of grouping, if you wish, between the purely individual and the conventional is reinterpretations of idioms. Because idioms of the kind that you refer to are precisely also when they lose their original motivation, like in your example, where the original meaning of banen gets lost and you only find it in the context of the idiom. In those cases, you also have a mechanism where people start reinterpreting that demotivated, so to speak, that no longer unmotivated, no longer motivated expression in function of the new meaning of the metaphorical meaning or the derived meaning that the expression as a whole has been getting. So that means, or an example of that is in Dutch, since you have a wegbanen, okay, you also have this expression, aan de weg timmeren. Now, aan de weg timmeren, it's interesting because there's also, as far as I can see, a distinction here between Netherlandic Dutch and Belgian Dutch. You have to ask people the question, what is the image that you have when you think of aan de weg timmeren? Now, okay, for those of you who don't speak Dutch, aan de weg timmeren is, well, simplistically translated, it's doing some carpentry at the road. Yeah? Working like a carpenter at the road or on the road. Some people interpret it as you're building a road. And for some reason that you use the term timmeren because you're, I don't know, that's not the way they build roads. But anyway, that's one possible interpretation. Originally, but that's a reinterpretation. Originally, aan de weg timmeren is to do your work on the outside of the building so that people can see that you're working. Yeah, it's to put yourself in the picture. So the loss of motivation leads to reinterpretations, but typically the reinterpretations are not purely individual and also not purely communal, at least in this case. In some cases, the reinterpretations are totally conventional. In other cases, there is a social structure. Some people think in that way, interpret it in that way. Some people are still closer to the original interpretation. So I would say, to your question, yes, we do need to, and in a sense, I would say it was implicit in what I've explained. We do need that level of conventionality, of communality, but let's not simplify or idealize it. Let's recognize that behind that level, there is a structure of different subgroups of the community, which may have different interpretations ultimately of the expressions in question.
You break us off when we, yeah, because of course we could go on for a long time.
Was our job.
Exactly. As long as you won't let us, then I'll feel free. What I'm really interested, and I'm sort of still surprised that you did not include this in your talk, is that the normativity precisely of this phenomena of the third kind, this conventionality, indeed not in the Saussurean sense, but more in the philosophical Lewis-like senses developed in the philosophy of language rather than in structuralist linguistics, provides a basis for the non-shakiness, as I would like to say it. You were saying the open-endedness and, or you might want to say shakiness of intersubjectivity. And I like the idea of open-endedness, but I don't like the idea of shakiness. These are positive, negative versus negative, evaluative, and I think we should go for the positive At least that's what I would like. And I find a basis for that in an understanding of intersubjectivity as a community level cultural phenomenon, where which makes intuitions about language by definition not purely individualistic. So it's a way of getting away from the cancel culture and other level kinds of things on a scientific basis, and is therefore, in my view, a crucial part of the total picture, and hence my surprise of you not mentioning it.
Okay, but that's because I'm critical. No. The thing is that I agree, and this, in a sense, there was the choice between is the glass half empty or is it half full? You can look at it in two ways, but why take the more critical point of view? Well, I do think that we have this tradition in linguistics of thinking too simplistically about that kind of norms, and of not sufficiently looking into miscommunication. Linguists tend to focus on adequate communication and think that in general that's the way things go. I'm not so certain about that. I think that linguistics need a bit of a corrective, and that it should also look more systematically into the sources of communication going wrong. And that explains the omission, if you wish.
Looking at miscommunication, I also find that a very nice and sometimes very revealing source of evidence for what things mean. For example, what is irony and all other stuff that you've been mentioning. But from an evolutionary perspective, it's sort of inevitable to conclude that most communication has to be in that sense successful, that it allows us human beings to coordinate mentally, to get on the same page in order, otherwise we would not be able to carry out our joint projects, and we would simply not be here, because that's the only reason that we managed to survive and outcompete others.
Well, I think ultimately, I think that's a fairly a prioristic element or argument, because you would never know how much better evolution might have been without miscommunication.
You should never ask, say to an evolutionary.
Yeah, so I mean, there's in your position, there's again, I tend to be critical. Don't put your trust too much in evolutionary explanations. Okay.
Dirk should have the last word.
Well, I was wondering how this conversation would evolve, but yeah, at some point we have to stop. Thank you very much, Ari and Dirk, for this interesting conversation. Actually, it's only now that I come to realize how this format that we've come up with looks like a PhD defense. So that's what people did a long time ago, and maybe it's not a bad idea to defend your research towards the end of your, well, at least your teaching career. Now, technology permitting, we're going to move to somewhere outside of this room, and I would like to ask Dagmar whether you can hear us.
I can hear you, yes. Can
Okay,
you hear me?
yes we can, so.
Sounds like, from Mars.
So then we're all set. Dagmar, well, the digital floor is yours.
Well, thank you. First of all, congratulations, Dirk. I'm looking forward to all of the free time you will have on your hands and that we can impose upon to use for all kinds of scientific endeavors. And I'm really sorry I can't be there with you in person. It's COVID travel restrictions. I would really have loved to be back in the auditorium where I listened to you introducing hundreds of first-year philology students to linguistics in 1993, and I'm one of those who got infected by the bug, and it seems to be pretty incurable. Something I'll always remain grateful to you for. I've prepared 2 points for discussion, and in proper vintage Geeraerts style, I will say that my second question consists of 2 sub-questions, so in total there will be 3 questions. The first thing I wanted to pick up on is, I mean, all of the questions are kind of methodological in nature, as Dirk Geeraerts already hinted at. So the first question has to do with meaning is use one. And, you know, Ludwig Wittgenstein is considered to be one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. And no doubt he's, you know, one of the most frequently cited by linguists and by cognitive linguists in particular. And lots of the papers dealing with meaning and with lexical meaning in particular start by citing Wittgenstein, who wrote that the meaning of a word is in its use, and are then often in distribution and direction, charting how words are used across context and what we can learn from that. And I'm, you know, one of those who've done that, guilty of it myself. And I was very surprised to learn that you know, the way in which we interpret that quote, or what we think that quote means, doesn't seem to be quite what Wittgenstein had in mind, or at least what philosophers think what Wittgenstein had in mind. And when I mentioned it to a French philosopher, I got very funny looks. And you can decide on the sense of funny that's activated here, you know, yourself. So basically, in a very short lecture, I was told that it's not quite the way we linguists think it is, that this signals Wittgenstein's shift in thinking between his Tractatus and his Investigationes, and it maps a general shift in 20th century philosophy, which is more generally a shift from seeing language as a fixed structure that's imposed upon the world to seeing it as a fluid structure that's intimately connected to our everyday practices and forms of life. So for the later Wittgenstein, which we tend to cite, creating meaningful statements is no longer a matter of mapping the logical form of the world, but it's a matter of using conventionally defined terms within what he calls language games that we play in our everyday life. And on this model, communication involves using conventional terms in a way that's recognized by a language community, but these conventions can differ for groups and for individuals. So apparently, what this quote indicates is that Wittgenstein had left this Platonic realm of pure logic and had rediscovered the world, but we linguists don't seem to have taken into account all of the dimensions of this world, including the individual and the personal, as you indicated. And as you hinted at towards the end of the lecture, the world of big data certainly isn't bothered by meaning as you would understand it. So they're happily charting, or they're very happy charting news in ever larger collections of data. And as a linguist who worked on meaning, things always felt a bit like David versus Goliath, you know, the diligent linguist, carefully annotating our samples with ever more intricate sets of variables, versus the computer scientist, throwing more and more data and more computing power at the same problem. And that's, you know, before we got to meet our newest friend, Dirk, who has read more than 3 billion words, has unlimited memory, has endless attention span, and outperforms most of his human namesakes on a range of NLP tasks. But what's really interesting, I find, is that even the BERT community admits readily that the reasons for BERT's state-of-the-art performance are not very well understood. Now, we know that BERT doesn't learn from data in the way human beings do, but somehow he seems to have developed word knowledge, some understanding of the language game we play, and also, as you indicated, some in the cognitive sciences would claim that linguists are now superfluous. So, as you put it, you know, we now have algorithms that perform amazingly well at simulating human behavior, but we would consider the presence of this internal experience of meaning or consciousness as the final frontier for the machine's performance. What I wanted to ask you is an old question that's today as relevant as it ever was. How much meaning can we extract from data and usage alone, especially when we think of usage not only as textual usage, but we can feed Bert with images, with video clips, we could give him sensory experience. But to put it in terms of the artificial intelligence debate, what would you say it will take for us to admit that the machine has consciousness? And what role do you think a linguist can play in establishing this?
Okay. I don't know in which direction to look. I am seeing you, Dagmar, but you may not be seeing me. The question I wanted to raise at the end, so the question about the philosophy of computational linguistics, ultimately, was, or can perhaps be rephrased in the following way. We tend to ask precisely the question that you asked a moment ago. What would it take for us to admit that a machine has consciousness, but perhaps even subconsciousness? God forbid. That's the usual question. But there's something tricky about that question, because if you at one point admit that you have a machine like that, what has happened at that point? Are you going to give legal rights to the machine because it's human? Or would it work the other way around, and would you treat people like machines? And that, I think, so the question, what precisely the perspective should be for dealing with the semantic performance of machines, so to speak, of algorithms. The question how to think about it is, at this point, the first question I'd like to ask. And I wouldn't have a specific answer to okay, you have a Turing test, but what exactly does it imply if we can't even very clearly define for ourselves what it means for us to use meaning, or what the meaning is that we realize. So that's a trap. It's a trap that we use this question, or we use this criterion. Machines are human if they can reproduce our meaning, or if they can reproduce our phenomenal inner experience of meaning. There wouldn't be a way of establishing that apart in a behaviorist way. So it would be almost automatically shifting the question to a perspective where you would say, okay, now behaviorally machines are the same as people, so let's treat people like machines. And that is what I wanted to do, was to point out that danger, to point out that the philosophical question should perhaps not be, can machines think, or are they just pretending to think? It is an interesting question, and people should definitely keep working on it. But it's a difficult question. First, it's a tricky question. First, because even with all the research I've done on semantics, which is a little bit, but with that research, I wouldn't be able to give clear criteria for what a machine would be able to do. And second, there is this danger of shifting the perspective and just, as I mentioned in the talk, leading to blind trust in machines. So I refuse to answer your question, but I hope you can go along with replacing it with another one.
Yes, I know. I really like that approach. I mean, as what I learned from spending years charting usage, so to speak, is that it's not meaning. But what meaning then is a completely different, defining what meaning then is a completely different ballgame. But I think one in which linguists should really play a prominent role.
Oh yes, of course, I agree there. Not that the linguists know how it works, but at least they have something to say about it. Like many other interdisciplinary or people from other disciplines.
This kind of nicely leads us to my second question, which consists of two sub-questions. So there's a paper that appeared in Cognitive Linguistics, the journal, in 1995 when you were editor-in-chief of the journal. And it's one of those papers where the title leaves a more lasting impression than perhaps the contents of the paper. And this was a paper by Sandra and Rice, and especially the subtitle, Mirroring Whose Mind, the Linguists or the Language Users, was something that really struck me. So when you talk about this phenomenal experience of meaning, then whose experience are we really talking about, or whose experience should we talk about? Because, you know, linguists, and in lexical semanticists in particular, are probably not representative of the wider population, right? We could be compared to the wine connoisseurs of language. We taste these fruity or those nutty tones or the hints of chocolate that are described on the label, but that definitely, you know, elude my taste buds. And I've personally found experimentation very helpful in this regard. To me, it's something that helps me calibrate my linguistic instruments. It tells me where north is. It tells me what knowledge I should aim to account for. And one of the many things you're widely known for is methodological innovation, but also rigor. And members of your team have done experimental work and have been among the first ones to do so in linguistics, but at the same time, psychological experimentation has never become a methodological cornerstone of your approach. And I wanted to ask you, what role do you see experimental work play in research on language more generally? Yeah, you can answer question 2A now.
Question 2A, a big role.
Okay.
But as I try to indicate, as far as I can see now, and that's the status question is of our type of research at this point. What I can see now is that we're not in a position yet to say this is the optimal methodological road to take, because the results that you get from the different approaches are different. And that's only a superficial answer, because the more underlying question is it even wise to assume that there is something like an optimal solution? In what I described as part of this agnostic approach, or with a comparison with the life force notion, it is clearly possible that, or let me perhaps put it this way, if you compare, for instance, the information that you could get from visual information, the information that you could get from textual information, the information that you could get from experimental data, different types of experimental data, then we don't know exactly how to think about those differences. It could be that they are just complementary, where you would say, okay, there is one thing, and that thing is the meaning of this expression, and there are different aspects, different facets to that meaning, and one method rather captures one facet, another method captures another facet, and another method captures yet another facet. That's a possibility. But at this point, we can't rule out that we're actually measuring different things. So from that point of view, again, perhaps I'm again refusing to answer the question, but I think I'm again trying to redefine the question a little bit, and to keep open possibilities that in the normal practice of linguistics, we rather easily skip over. We rather easily think, yeah, there is such a thing as meaning. So what is the best method? That's an assumption, and at this point it's important to treat it as an assumption. Which doesn't mean that we're back at square one, but still okay.
Yeah.
To be.
No.
To be.
And it's also a nice preparation for question 2B. which is a question about, methodology more generally. As you know, I like to work interdisciplinary as well, and one of my main collaborators likes to say that everything's in flux. And I think he's right. But the problem then is, like, how do we get a methodological handle on this flux? If everyone who's run an experiment knows that you must try to limit, degrees of freedom. And everybody who's done any computational modeling knows that you must fix your inputs and your outputs. But the situation in which you have described, and that I'm very sympathetic to, seems to be calling for some multi-dimensional methodology. And at the same time, we should, avoid ending up in the trap that our bird friend fell into with his, 500 millions of parameters, and everything becomes intractable. And this kind of reminds me of what you wrote in your introduction to the Oxford Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics. Again, one of these statements that made a lasting impression on me is where you said, meaning is core to the cognitive linguistics enterprise, and meaning is inherently subjective. So for that reason, some would say that meaning is by definition incompatible with an objectivist method. I mean, you've shown ways in which it could be made compatible, and you've argued for digital humanities that makes use of the materials and the methods provided by current data science, but subjects researchers to treating them with a careful, circumstantial, and conjectural interpretation. So I was kind of wondering, if I would be a PhD student today knocking on your door, what would you recommend me to do? How did you practically see that proposal take shape?
Oh dear. I would probably have to turn you down. Because if you really want to go along that line, then you would have to find an interdisciplinary environment. And we don't have a lot of interdisciplinary environments. So of course okay, let me perhaps say or answer to a question that you did not ask explicitly, but you mentioned this quote from the introduction. And it has the term subjective in there. Of course, at this point, I would probably add and intersubjective.
Okay.
And in general, it's important to realize that given the talk that I presented earlier, it was that conceptualization of things wasn't there 30 years ago. I mean, there's also an implicit evolution in there. And the evolution has certainly gone in the direction that was basically also mentioned by Ari, in the sense that you have to take into account the communal thing, the intersubjective aspects, and so on. So that's one point. I did want to point out that. That was not a direct answer to your question, but I think it's important to mention that. But so for your direct question, if you want to do a bit more of what is, you say, multi-dimensional, perhaps it's in a sense meta-methodological, right?
Yeah.
It's comparing methodologies, but it's also comparing methodologies with a keen awareness that you're not entirely certain what the object is that you are measuring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, I think that would be like the situation if you were a PhD student in the early 1900s and you would knock on someone's door and ask the question, I want to become a doctor in life sciences and I want to study the life force. What would I do? What should I do? Because I have this idea that it's not just a unitary thing. Well, the idea would be, okay, there are so many different things you can do and you can't do them all by yourself. So try to find an environment where someone is looking at the respiratory system and someone is looking at hormones or endocrinology and so on and so on and so on. So that would be the basic point for saying, I alone as a supervisor could help you with one specific perspective, two in the best of cases. But if you really want to get to the heart of the matter, then you will either be very patient, have to be very patient, or you will have to find an environment where people are looking at it from different perspectives.
Yeah, well, I would fully agree with you. That I think to keep this image of the PhD defense, I think you shown scientific maturity in rephrasing all of the questions your examiners ask. You're good to pass.
Thank you. I mean, after all these years, I should know the tricks of the trade, no?
Well, thank you, Dagmar. Thank you, Dirk, for this lively debate. And well, Dirk, it's encouraging. It looks like you will be passing the exam. Yeah. But there's one more discussant. So we're not there yet. So, Lisbeth, I'll give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Dear Dirk, let me start by apologizing for not being there in person. I would have loved to be there, but decided that for many reasons it's currently wiser for me to follow this event from home. Thank you very much for your inspiring and challenging lecture. I hope, but I'm actually quite sure, that you enjoyed preparing and giving it as much as we all enjoyed listening to it. I may not be there live, but at least I can join you now through Teams. Thank you to Carleen and Stefano for all their practical help, and hello to the other two panel members, Dagmar and Ari. I was invited to sit on this panel before I was elected Dean of the Faculty, so I assume that I'm not sitting here pro forma. The colleagues organizing this wonderful afternoon for you must have sensed that there is more that binds us than just my title, and they're right. For years, we were part of the same research unit and cognitive linguistics research community, but it was only when I became Vice Dean of the Faculty 6 years ago that we got to know each other better. You were chair of the research unit of linguistics for 4 years, and as such also participated in the faculty board meetings. It won't come as a surprise to those present here today that as a member of the faculty board, you made an essential contribution. With your ever-sharp observations, you often knew how to distinguish main from minor issues and to bring discussions back to the essence. With your knack for systemic thinking, you always managed to identify the more structural issues underlying concrete questions and challenges, thus helping us all to keep focus. I would like to thank you warmly for that. Together with the faculty board, we already said goodbye to you early in September. And on that occasion, I praised you as someone who has set new standards in many areas. You put the faculty and KU Leuven firmly on the international map with your research into social variation, diachronic change of meaning and vocabulary, and your focus on the importance of empirical methods for the description of meaning. You didn't shy away from scientific services, and you are the founding father of the research group QLVL, set up as a unique research lab with a clear thematic focus and a strongly developed team spirit in which numerous young researchers were trained. Today's event, generously organized by your team, testifies to what you have managed to create there and how much your efforts are appreciated by the QLVL members. As Dean, and so in the name of the faculty, I would like to repeat my words of thanks and appreciation for what you have achieved and what you have done for the faculty. In the margin of the faculty board meetings, you and I have had regular discussions about the organizational structure of the faculty, about centralist versus regionalist models of governance, about the position of languages within the faculty, about the relationship between research units and curricula, a relationship that is complex, especially when, as is the case at KU Leuven, there are 3 different research units linked to a myriad of language programs, namely the research units of linguistics, literary sciences, and translation studies. I didn't always agree with you, but I have always appreciated your observations and arguments as particularly thorough and well-founded. And my questions today are therefore on these themes. I have 3 questions for you. One on the structural organization of research and teaching, one on the relationship between linguistics and literary science, and a final one on the concept of a research group. All of these questions are, in my opinion, not only relevant to the Faculty of Arts of KU Leuven, but to all those present working in academia, and so I hope that your answers will be too. My first question relates to particular aspects of the structural organization of the faculty. From a research perspective, the faculty is organized in research units and research groups. And from a curricular perspective, it is organized in program committees. Together, these structures are supposed to allow for a dynamic approach to the core tasks of a faculty, performing top-notch research, offering excellent teaching, and making sure that research and teaching interact in the curricular offer. But do they always succeed in doing so? What is your opinion on the interaction between research units and curricula? Are we missing opportunities there? You spoke about indeterminacy in semantic description and the importance of acknowledging it. Is there room for some level of indeterminacy at the level of the structural organization of the faculty, in your opinion? That's my first question.
Okay, I think I would, because that's something that's becoming more and more clear to me now. People are framing this event more and more as an examination over me. So before I start answering, I was wondering if I fail, can I stay?
Yes, you can do. You won't have an office anymore. That's a very important rule in the faculty, but you can stay.
Okay. Now yes. One thing to pick up on the final point of your question, I would say there's too much indeterminacy already. It's not that you have to build in more indeterminacy. There's too much already, and it exists to a large extent also because the research structure and the teaching organization are no longer fully parallel. They used to be in the time of the philologies, and one advantage of the model we had then, I'm old enough to have lived through that model. The advantage that we had then was also that we didn't have a representative form of teaching organization. Everybody who taught in a certain curriculum was present in the discussions of that curriculum. And I think that on the whole, of course, even in those concepts, in that context, I used to be critical, but even then, or looking back on it, I think it was beneficial. I think one of the main problems that you have now in the structural organization in the faculty is what you might call alienation of teachers with regard to the curricula, with regard to the programs, because they're very often not directly involved in the discussions on matters of teaching. So that would be a first thing that I would look at. And of course, it's not directly related to research organization, but it would already help a lot, I think, if you could simplify the structure, the teaching organization structure in such a way that you get more commitment simply by involving people. Structurally speaking, I think that could be achieved by having a closer look at the link between the curricular commissions, I don't know how you would express that in English, but those lower level organizational structures and how they get a certain autonomy, so that at least at that level you get the right degree of interaction and commitment. A further step would be to see how that might then relate to the research organization. But basically, it might, and of course, I don't think that you can, as things are now, that you could reach an organization where there is a one-to-one relationship between, let's say, the teaching groups and the research groups. In principle, it might be possible to think of cells, if you wish, where people form a research unit and at the same time are responsible for a certain group of a certain set of classes. That's the old departmental approach, but then maybe at a more restricted level. It is possible to do that, but I don't think it would be, it's really necessary if you can carry out some changes in the teaching organization as such, simplifying that and making it more involving would, I think, be a major thing to do.
First step, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll take your advice with me. My second question then. I was struck by your passionate plea at the end of your lecture for a digital humanities that revives what you called a philological conception of language studies and embraces a conceptual meaning that is critical, but in a careful, circumstantial and conjectural way. I think many in the faculty see you as an ardent advocate of linguistic research and teaching, evidently. Is your observation about the evolution that has taken place in linguistics in recent years through the emergence of cognitive linguistic and usage-based approaches and the opening up of a view of language that is contextualized, is that also a plea for removing, or could that also be a plea for removing the barriers between linguistic and literary research and strengthening the ties between them? And can you relate this question to your perspective on the language curriculum at university level, a language curriculum where, as you know, in Belgium, in Flanders, we combine linguistics and literary studies in one curriculum?
Okay. Yes, I think that's one of the main points I wanted to get across. I do think that developments in linguistics, both theoretical, let's say this recontextualizing movement, and methodological, if you interpret the methodologies in the way that I try to indicate, are creating a basis for a renewed interaction between literary scholars and linguists. At the same time, it's also implicit in what I try to say that language studies should be broader than linguistics and literary studies. If you take the idea that a proper study of language should be broadly interdisciplinary, if you take that idea seriously, then basically we should, up to a point, I might say, we should have more connections outside of this faculty, or create connections outside of this faculty with the kind of curriculum that we are offering. And of course, up to a point, you're trying to do that. Recent appointments in digital humanities, computational approaches go in that direction. But of course, that's always staying within the faculty. And a lot of the relevant research is being done outside of the faculty. So a closer connection with psychological research, sociological research, obviously informational informatics and computational research would be something to look out for, I would say.
Okay, that's a line of thinking that is definitely also explored at university level at this stage. So yeah, I agree. A final question then. I'm curious to know which aspects of the way in which you set up the research unit QLVL you are most proud of or happy with, and what, with hindsight, you would do differently. In a report by the External Advisory Board that visited the faculty in September, it is suggested that research groups are pivotal to maximize the faculty's research potential and that we do not, at this stage, grasp all opportunities incorporated in our structural model consisting of research units and research groups. So which lessons have you learned from your own years within QLVL that you think are relevant to this broader discussion within the faculty?
So you want a truthful answer?
If possible.
Okay, let me first say this. Why are these research units important? Well, they are important because we don't have a hierarchical structure in the faculty. Faculties in other countries are very often organized in a departmental way, where you have a head of the department, and the head of the department has a lot to say about what happens in the department. Or they're organized in a structure with chairs, where the chair is the top monkey, so to speak, in a certain research area, and can and then automatically has a number of people, limited, but has a number of people working with the chair. So what you get there automatically is bundling of effort in a certain direction. So that's point one. Point two is that you do need that way of creating critical mass. I'm convinced that you, in the present day, you can't survive. I mean, there are niche topics in which you can survive as an individual, which I will try out now that I'll be retired. But in principle or in practice, it's very difficult to survive or to play an interesting role unless you have a group. Because this faculty does not have because all professors are equal, right? In the faculty, all those professors are trying to build their individual terrain. There's a lot of territorial debate there, and imposing a structure of research groups on the faculty, I've always seen that as, of course, I've tried to build my own group because I was soon aware of the fact that I'm very limited in what I can do. So I needed other people. I've been very vampirical in that sense. But it was necessary to reach a certain mass. What at one point then the faculty suggested by imposing the structure of research group is, okay, we're not going to do this hierarchically, but just let it happen bottom up. But of course, it's not happening bottom up, not all the time, because most of the people don't, or many people don't see the importance of this kind of bundling of efforts. And that's, I think, why the research visits could point out that the opportunities are not being used. So what could you do about that? Well, there are a number of options. I'm not sure whether I have an optimal one or a best one, but on the basis of what you of what there already is, you can try to identify key areas where you would try to bring people together. It would imply that some people have to reorient their research a little bit, which is going to be difficult to realize. Another way would be to impose a hierarchical structure. There are ways of doing that. I mean, or there are, let's say, there are ways of nudging people to work together better. But I do think that you need a kind of incentive for people to go along with this model. And the most important thing would be that people realize that if they want to reach a certain level with their kind of research, then it's most of the time not possible if they just remain within their individual bubble. And an individual bubble would be a professor with then, in the best of cases, a new PhD student every 2 or 4 years. That level of organization, which in practice is still very often the level of real organization in this faculty, that level is too restricted. And so the imposition of research groups is a way of achieving that. And so there were other aspects to your question. One aspect is what did I, you didn't phrase it that way, but what did I regret most, or rather what went wrong? Well, one thing that definitely went wrong is that the faculty itself, I'm not going to name names, but the faculty itself did not see soon enough that that was the model that I was trying to develop for my team. Well, okay, let me not go into details, but you need support from the faculty to, so if you have someone who's trying to do that, give them the support they need, if that is the model you want to follow. And then the other thing is, what did I like most, or what did I get out of it? It's interacting with the PhD students. I mean, you should be there. You should be in one of those team meetings. It's really, really remarkable. In the best of cases, sometimes it goes wrong, but in the best of cases, it's really stimulating and awesome what intellectual level you can reach when you have a number of committed people and bright people working together. And that's what I'm going to miss. But
Thank you, Dirk. I think these were wonderful observations to end with. So thanks again, and I hope we can continue our conversations.
So do I.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisbeth. Thank you, Dirk, for this nice discussion, which started as an exam for Dirk and which ended as more homework for us and especially for our new dean. But hey, and you already have so much work, but yeah, you asked for it. Okay, we have to look at the time. There's only time for one question from the audience. There is one question, Ortin.
Run to her.
This wonderful and inspiring valedictory lecture and valedictory also in the sense that we all feel blessed by you and are very grateful for that. I'm a bit of an interloper here because I'm the guy from literature. But the wonderful thing about your lecture is that you made me very welcome, and Lisbeth also touched on that, and I'm very happy to note this end to the parting of the ways, as you yourself put it. You also engaged a little bit in, or you referred to the fact that etymological speculation is okay, but it has its limits. But I'd like to ask you in that connection, if you could just play a little bit with the etymological question of the logi bit in philology as distinct of the logi bit in psychology, and whether you could say something as a linguist with expertise in this matter, but also as somebody with a knowledge of interdisciplinarity in the fields, what that makes you think of.
Yeah. Actually, I think I would, of course, the easy answer is etymological reasoning is a game. Yeah. And of course, in this case, you could use it to play with the polysemy of the logos in the two, or the logi in the two the two terms, because in one case in philology, it's the object of your attention, of the love that you apply to the logos, let's say, whatever that would be. In the other case, it's the method that you apply to. But perhaps if you look at it in that way, then precisely that is a helpful polysemy for the kind of fusion that or fusionist, or whatever term you would want to use, that I wanted to bring across. I think it's good to precisely to bring together those two strands of related with language, paying attention, being careful about language, but at the same time also being, well, methodologically as rigorous as possible about it. And to come back to your initial point, I really regret, one of the regrets throughout my career is that all those points of debate that we could have had between linguists and literary scholars for some reason didn't come up. So for those of you who are still active in this context, pick it up. It's going to be interesting.
Okay, thank you. Once again, thank you for all the discussions. I'm afraid we have to stop the discussion here. We're going to have another small break. Let's see. Yes, a small break, and we'll start again with a small closing session at 5. Yeah, okay. See you in 7 minutes.
Zijn we de delegatie?
De
Ja.
jury heeft een geheime beraadslaag.
Toch niet erg dat ik een beetje devil zeg.
Nee, maar
Ik vond het leuk.
Nee, want ik ben het er wel mee eens, maar ik zou het nog iets genuanceerder.
Nee, maar het leukste aan deze dingen vind ik dat het voor zo'n discussie en het ook even, soms even scherp stellen, mensen in het publiek de gelegenheid krijgen om na te denken, om kwartjes te laten vallen.
Zet ik wat doen. Oh dear, oh dear.
Ja.
Ja?
Ja, ja.
Het is there were about 100 people
A lot of
watching.
congratulations.
Really?
And 2 questions.
Ja, oké.
Dat wil ik. Ik ga toch niet meer.
Nee.
Ga dan maar terug.
Ja, hoe zou ik zeggen, een marathon. Maar ik heb er echt van tevoren. Omdat je ook nog een beetje gelijk.
Ja, maar ik ga de camera draaien, wacht.
En dus heb ik een klein boekje mee. Ik zou toch uitzoomen, hè? Alleen maar met literatuur te maken. Ik zou toch wel uitzoomen.
Oké.
In zo'n envelop.
Mooier kan niet.
Ongeveer het kleinste boekje wat ik kan zetten. En dan altijd, als ik iets van ondanks alle lees ik veel, maar ik heb er echt van genomen.
Ja, juist. Ik
Hier ga ik erin. Hou je goed? Tot ziens.
Ja, oké. Wij kunnen dat doen.
Ik weet niet wat
We geven mensen...
Ik weet niet wat de vraag staat van micro's en wat er nu...
Ja, ik weet het.
Okay, I propose we continue. In our research group, over the last years, we've grown fond of tokens, token-based distributional semantics. And the token we want to talk about now is a token of gratitude. As Lisbeth already said, the idea of this event grew in our research group. and before that, the research group grew. um, and so the question in the group was, how can we express our gratitude to Dirk for, first of all, for creating that research group, and then having it evolve from the smallest research group in our department to the largest. And well, we like to believe that that is because it's a very attractive group. At least in any case, it's a very dynamic group. And we love to work in that research group. So there were a few brainstorm sessions. How can we express our gratitude? And I would like to say a few words about those brainstorm sessions. So the idea is that well, what emerged in those sessions was a metaphor. You know, in cognitive linguistics, people like to use metaphors. So we looked at Dirk's work, and what we saw is that Dirk, as he said only a moment ago, a good discussion is only a good discussion if a research idea emerges, and that's very vintage Dirk. Any conversation, you leave that conversation with new ideas, new things to do, and if he's done that in locally, I talked about creating this group. What that was a seed that was planted and grown into a large group, and I think a very well, a group that is alive and kicking, but also internationally, he has planted many seeds. It was already mentioned that he was one of the pioneers in cognitive linguistics with his PhD, but also with other work on semantics and the prototypicality research. So we started thinking about that, planting seeds, and then a lot of ideas really have taken root. That semantic work has proved to be very important within cognitive linguistics, and also locally our group started to grow, and it developed new strong branches. There was not just a strong trunk, there were strong branches. As linguistics and cognitive linguistics evolved, we had new evolutions, new transformations. We talked today about the quantitative turn. Once again, something where Dirk took a leading position and steered the group. That's a very strong branch. We also talked about the social turn, cognitive social linguistics, where we have an expansion of the idea of what is meaning and having it have a richer and wider view on that. Even more recently, there's Dagmar mentioned those methods, using techniques from computational linguistics and putting them to use in theoretical and descriptive linguistics, in semantics, all these new branches, and they bear fruit. Yes, we see that locally, we see that in the international research community. Well, this is a methodological pun. The point I want to make here is that it's not just Dirk and Dirk's work who stands tall as an influential, strong tree, but by inspiring others, you can see that other trees emerge, and it becomes one large forest. And yes, for those who know what random forests are, this one is a very non-random forest. It's very clear and very well structured, because that's one of the things that Dirk really can do. He can create clarity and insight. So I guess maybe you already have an idea about what we would like to give to Dirk, but we came up with an idea where eventually we're not going to give him anything. Let me explain. So our token of gratitude, well, yeah, it has something to do with trees. And we were very surprised when they sent us the slides that they wanted to use today. And we thought, oh, how can you know that? Yes, exactly. This is what we'd like to give him, recognize that slide. So, but yeah, why are we not going to give him something? Because many people contributed. And so we have lots of money. We won't say how much. But the people in the know tell us that it can be a substantial tree. So it was not very practical to bring the tree here, let alone to have Dirk take the tree home to his garden where it belongs. So we will be giving you a tree, but we will not be giving you a tree. We've made an arrangement so that you can pick your own tree and plant it in your garden wherever you want. And there's another reason for that, because we couldn't choose which tree, right? So we know that Dirk likes clarity, creates structure, so maybe it fits in a French garden, but yeah, Renaissance garden would also be very well. But the the point is that we decided to let the master do the choosing, right? So we can choose this one or that one. I don't think he'll choose that one, but he's free to do so if he wants to. That's basically what we're going to do now. And it's time now to yield the floor to the actual organizations, the people who did, well, all of the work here. So there goes the tree. Congratulations, Dirk, and thank you very much for your generosity throughout the years. So now I'm yielding the floor to the people who did all the work organizing this. Carlene Franco, Stefano De Pascale, Mariana Montes, Wei Wei Tang. Well, Carlene, it's your turn.
Okay. Thank you. I do have a presentation, so yeah, sorry. But I can begin already. So yeah, hi everyone. Hi, Dirk. Well, congratulations, Dirk, on your great lecture today. I'm very happy that I got to take part in it in this room again, where I probably met you for the first time, although you won't remember. When I was taking your ATW course, I think 14 years ago. So it's nice to be here. I think most of the people in the audience know why I'm standing here, but and what I'm about to say also. But I think you might be wondering what I'm about to say. So I know there have been quite a number of surprises for you over the oh your face. Okay. Sorry. A number of surprises for you over the past few years, months. So there was the new paradigm, the Change of Paradigms, New Paradoxes book, and then last year there was the Dictionary. A few months ago, you got this surprise question to hold this valedictory lecture. Then a few weeks ago, we announced that there would be this panel after the lecture, and then I guess a couple of hours ago, you got to find out who was on the panel. Then a few minutes ago, you got a tree. But there is one final thing that we've been keeping a secret from you, and this is actually a secret that we've been keeping for a much longer time. As a side note, Dirk actually told me that he doesn't really like surprises that much recently, but yeah. But so before I spill the beans and just to raise the suspense a bit more for Dirk, let me give you an idea of what Dirk's professional life, I think, has looked like for the past year and a half or so, at least from my perspective. So as he mentioned, the most recent major project that he has worked on is the nephological semantic project, where we use
computational techniques to use all kinds to answer all kinds of lexicological questions, mostly related to many of the things that he talked about today. And it was a great project. It still is. We found out many very interesting things, but there is one thing kind of crucial that we weren't really able to finish yet, and that is to publish our results in a book. Now, Dirk, I have to disappoint you. I don't have my chapters yet, but I hope you will still be happy with the surprise that we do have for you. So it's not the Nephological Semantics book, but it's another book. So I can show it here. Yeah, so and I was actually, when I got your draft presentation earlier this week, I was kind of happy that you put cognitive social linguistics right in the middle of the slide, because some time ago we thought that it would be time to publish a new book on this topic in your honor. So this is the book. I also have a copy here. This is your copy, actually, so the only copy so far also. Yeah, together with Gitte Christians, Stefano De Pascale, Laura Rossel, who's here too, and Weiwei Zhang, we published this book entitled Cognitive Social Linguistics Revisited. And also, to ensure that the book wouldn't be all too prototypical, yeah, you will see, you can already see, you're looking at it, that it's not really a typical, you can read it right now, that's fine. It's not really an ordinary book. So there are at least two ways in which it stands out. So first, size-wise, it's quite lengthy. So it has more than 600 pages. But the contributions in the book are all quite short. So at this moment, I also want to thank the authors for sticking to our very strict limits on that. So, you know, as a quantitative linguist, you know that it's a lot of contribution. It's a lot of pages, but short contributions. So you can tell that there were many of your academic friends who were very willing to contribute to this book. So in total, it's about 50 contributions, I believe. And then second, content-wise, it's also not really prototypical because it doesn't really stick to studies in cognitive social linguistics per se, but we actively seeked out ways in which the field could be extended and what current trends are and how other viewpoints from underrepresented or neighboring fields could be included. And as a result, it really covers a broad range of topics. I've got them on a slide here. Yeah, I could barely fit this on the slide, as you can see. A broad range of topics such as, you know, lexicology, electrometry, but also figurative language, grammatical research, and interdisciplinary work. So, of course, we wouldn't have this book right now without the help of very many people that were involved. So first, I would like to thank the editor, Dirk Geeraerts, and our contacts there, Birgit Sievert and Kirsten Burger, for their willingness to take up this project and also for speeding up the production process to levels never experienced before. I also want to thank Charlotte from Convertus for answering all our questions while we were proofing the book. Then second, enormous thanks also go to all the authors. So not just for contributing their very interesting papers, but also for sticking to our strict deadlines and for bearing with us during this quite intense process. And I also want to thank everyone who has reviewed one or more chapters for the book. Then I want to thank the people who were in the know behind the scenes. So Eline Zenner, Dirk Spearman, Mariana Montes, and actually everyone at QLVL for help with all our questions, but mostly for all your support with this project. And then finally, I personally also want to thank all of my co-editors, so Stefano, Lara, Weiwei, and Gitte. I think we made an excellent team, and I personally truly feel that I couldn't have done this without you. Gitte also sends you your many congratulations from Madrid. So yeah, surprise, Dirk. I actually have one other thing to say. We also, before we head to the reception, we also have bought something, for our panelists. So we really want to thank our panelists as well for, you know, attending today, for accepting our invitation. So, and we actually also got something for Dirk Speelman for chairing. um, yeah, and finally, I just want to thank everyone who came here today in person or virtually. We all very much appreciate it. So I think we can go to the reception then, or Dirk wants to say something.
I don't like surprises, but I'm changing my opinion.
Je bent niet boos? Ik ben me al maanden aan het afvragen, vind je boos? Ja, dat is een goed idee. Yeah, just for the reception, so the COVID rules are right now that you keep your mask on at all times, except when you're actually eating or drinking. So yeah, just keep a distance from anyone, don't shake hands, keep your mask on, etc. I think, yeah.
Dank dat je daarmee bezig bent.